August 8, 1944, fields south of Caen, Normandy. German commander Michael Wittmann adjusts the binoculars inside his Tiger 07 and observes in silence an endless column of M4 Sherman tanks approaching over the horizon. Since the day before, his company had destroyed dozens of them. The Tiger kept its promise, every shot an impact, every advance a wall of steel. In Berlin, Hitler's favorite phrase was still repeated, "One Tiger equals a battalion." That conviction was about to be crushed under the weight of a reality that no cannon could pierce. Because there, in that camp, Wittmann was not only facing tanks, he faced statistics. While Germany produced 1,347 Tigers over the course of 3 years, the United States was making 49,234 Shermans and delivering hundreds a week on the Western Front. This video is about that contrast, the myth of technical superiority against the impersonal force of the assembly line, the belief in the perfect machine against the brutality of numbers. Let's investigate how the best tank of the war was swallowed up by American industrial logic, because in modern warfare, excellence is an ideal, but scale, it is a sentence. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any metaphor. In 3 years, Germany produced 1,247 Tiger tanks, each a masterpiece, handmade, revered as invincible. In the same period, the United States launched 49,234 Shermans. This gives, on average, 36 American tanks for every German Tiger. But these numbers are just the beginning, because behind each Sherman was a depot, a railroad track, a maintenance battalion, and an instruction manual simple enough for a recruit to solve in the field. It wasn't a battle of armor. It was an avalanche of industrial repetition. If you value this type of analysis, based on facts, figures, and historical memory, consider supporting this work with a like and a subscription. This helps the channel to continue revealing what really won the war. The Tiger's story begins with a seductive promise. In May 1941, at Hitler's mountain retreat, the biggest names in German engineering, Ferdinand Porsche, the Henschel brothers, and high command generals, presented the first prototypes of what would become the Panzerkampfwagen 6. Almost impenetrable armor, 88mm cannon capable of destroying any Allied vehicle at 2,000 meters, refined engineering and imposing appearance. "This tank is worth a battalion," Hitler said. The order was immediate, accelerated production even before the tests were completed. It was there that what would be the apex of German doctrine was born, winning by absolute quality. Each Tiger required 300,000 hours of human labor. Its 26,000 components were assembled manually by specialized workers. The transmission was calibrated with micrometric precision. Even the painting received individual visual inspection. It was, in fact, a mechanical masterpiece. But the obsession with perfection carried an invisible poison. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, American doctrine was taking an opposite and equally relentless course. In 1940, Roosevelt calls William Knudsen, former president of General Motors, and asks for something direct: 50,000 planes and 50,000 tanks. Knudsen's response would define the American path in the war. "Mr. President, we cannot build the best tanks, but we can build most of them." The logic was clear: simple, reliable machines repairable by any soldier in the field. Sherman's project was born like this. A tank that could be assembled from truck parts with welded armor, interchangeable engines, standard ammunition, and easy maintenance. Instead of war engineers, Detroit put housewives, teenagers, and civilian laborers to weld and assemble tanks as if they were automobiles. At its peak, the Detroit tank arsenal finished a Sherman every 48 minutes. There was no beauty. There was no prestige. There was a number. It took Germany 16 months to reach a monthly production of 100 Tigers. The US, and in less than a year had 11 factories delivering nearly 3,500 Shermans a month. The difference was arithmetic. The American assembly line produced a tank while the Germans were still adjusting the gearbox of theirs. Most of the Tigers were finished at Henschel's factory in Kassel with 9,000 workers and dozens of supervisors. A single measurement error paralyzed the line. Production was delicate, expensive, and vulnerable to interruptions. In contrast, Chrysler's tank arsenal occupied more than 1 million square feet. It was larger than all the German tank factories combined, and it worked 24 hours a day in 3 shifts, non-stop, not even at Christmas. The German Minister of Armaments himself, Albert Speer, would later write that Germany had no war industry. It had handicrafts on a scale. He tried to rationalize production, cut variants, standardize parts, but it was too late. Industrial culture was already committed to the pursuit of perfection, and perfection doesn't scale. In December 1942, while Germany was delivering 34 Tigers, the US was dropping 3,500 Shermans. This is the statistic that many German generals ignored or chose not to believe. American production was 100 times higher that month. If you were surprised by this number, comment here. Logistics wins. Because that's exactly what this story proves. German doctrine was based on one-on-one duels. 1 Tiger against 5, 10, even 12 enemy tanks. The logic was technical: better range, better armor, better crew. And in the open field, Tiger won. But modern warfare is not a duel, it is an infinite line of replacement. With each Tiger lost, Germany set back weeks of production. For every Sherman lost, the US pushed another across the dock in a matter of hours. At Fort Knox, each soldier trained in real tanks, with interchangeable parts. In Germany, many crew members arrived at the front without ever having started the engine of a Tiger. Tactical doctrine has found an operational wall. The American tank was called by Goebbels a Detroit can on the rails. But that's exactly what it needed to be. Cheap, fast, functional, and replaceable, because that was the American logic. The tank was disposable. The crew did not. And this simple inversion of values changed the war. Each month, Germany bet its resources on a machine that required 3 months of technical training and 6 months of training. Each crew member killed was an almost irreparable loss. The Americans, with their reservation system and standardization, were able to change entire teams in 48 hours. The difference was beginning to become not only tactical, but existential. Germany was fighting with excellence. America was struggling with pace. But none of this had yet reached the front. Not yet in 1943. Belief in the Tiger remained firm in the German High Command. The commanders were confident that if each Tiger destroyed 10 Shermans, the war could be balanced. But a sentence in General Heinz Guderian's diary, after receiving the first intelligence reports on Allied production, would end this optimism coldly. If these figures are half true, we have already lost this war. And yet, he didn't know the most terrible. Because while the Tigers required special railroad cars, premium fuel, and delicate transportation, the Shermans were being shipped by entire ships in stacks, ready to run. And that operation, the mass shipment of American tanks to Europe, had not even begun yet, because D-Day was yet to come. The German High Command wanted a weapon that would impose fear, not just a tank, a statement. After the surprise of the Soviet invasion and the embarrassment with the Russian T-34, fast, tilted, difficult to destroy, Hitler demands a jump, not in quantity, in technical supremacy. The Panzerkampfwagen 6. Tiger is not born out of an operational need, but out of a personal obsession. Ferdinand Porsche, a genius engineer obsessed with bold solutions, proposes a model with electric transmission. Henschel presents a more conservative mechanical design. Hitler hesitates. Prototypes are tested under pressure. Porsche, recklessly, had already had 90 chassis manufactured before the final approval, which would never come. The Tiger Henschel is chosen. Porsche's chassis become platforms for another monster, the Elephant. But the damage was already done. The Tiger program was already born with excessive complexity and built-in waste. The Tiger demanded the impossible. Weighing 57 tons, its 100 mm frontal armor withstood direct hits from almost all Allied guns. Its 88 mm KWK-36 gun was derived from the Luftwaffe's most feared anti-aircraft gun, and now, adapted for land, it destroyed any enemy tank before it was even seen. In tests, it hit targets at more than 2,000 meters with artillery accuracy. No other tank gun did this in 1942. The engineers spared nothing: interlocking wheels for stability, high-revving Maybach engines, Zeiss precision optical sights, integrated radio with direct communication between captain and crew. He was, in fact, a colossus. But there was a cost. Each Tiger took on average 300,000 hours of work to assemble. Produced almost by hand, each unit required unique pieces, manually adjusted. No assembly line, no real standardization. Some parts required more machining time than entire Allied aircraft engines. Germany invested scarce industrial capacity in a model that, in the best scenario, could produce 100 units per month, and this without interruptions. In contrast, American logic was based on extreme standardization. The Sherman had versions, but all used similar, interchangeable components with simplified field maintenance. A Tiger that broke down on the field could take weeks to come back. A damaged Sherman could return to combat within 24 hours. The German choice was more than technical, it was ideological. The Reich believed that technological superiority was proof of civilizational superiority. There was prestige in the Tiger. Propaganda posters showed him as a symbol of German power. Its crews were trained as elite. Each Tiger was named, numbered, revered. It was a status piece. But the war in the countryside was different. Engineers warned that the Tiger's excessive weight made it unsuitable for conventional bridges. Many Tigers had to cross rivers in forced march or wait for special bridges to be built. Mobility was sacrificed in the name of armor. The autonomy was low. Fuel consumption was unsustainable. And German logistics, based on worn-out rails and trucks, couldn't keep up. Speer, the Minister of Armaments, would try to reverse the mistake. He proposed lighter, simplified versions, but it was ignored. Hitler wanted monsters. The even heavier Tiger II would come soon, and with it, the promise of total invincibility. Meanwhile, the Americans had already begun tests with flaming, bridge-propelling, and amphibious versions of the Sherman, and the production line did not stop. The paradox was stark. Germany built a tank to win any individual battle. The US built a tank to be in every battle at the same time. The belief in the Tiger as a strategic solution was fueled by its tactical victories. In isolated combats, he destroyed entire columns. But with each victory, a wear and tear, an irreparable loss. Each Tiger was such a high investment that its destruction caused damage to morale and logistics. General Heinz Guderian, father of the German armored divisions, would warn in 1943, "We are building tanks that we cannot lose." But it was too late. The cult of the perfect machine had taken root. In practice, the Tiger became a museum piece on the battlefield, a steel monument that impressed but did not multiply. While a Sherman could be pushed by a tractor and put back into action, a Tiger would need 3 specialized vehicles just to be towed. When bogged down, it was usually abandoned. When it broke, it became a target. By 1944, more than 50% of Tiger's losses were not from direct combat, but from mechanical failures, jams, or the inability to evacuate. Still, in the German imagination, the Tiger remained unbeatable. But he was no longer respected for what he did, but feared for what it cost. An SS commander would write, "Every time I lose a Tiger, I feel like the Reich bleeds more than the field." In contrast, American commanders were given clear instructions. Advance. If the tank breaks, leave it. Another will come. This difference, subtle and brutal, separated entire doctrines. By the end of 1943, the Germans had managed to produce only 500 Tigers. The Americans, in the same interval, had already surpassed the 17,000 Sherman mark. The difference was not just one of rhythm, it was of reality. The Germans were at war with their own choice, an aesthetic, technical, almost philosophical choice, and they were losing, because excellence without scale is poetry. But war, it is statistics, and this statistic was about to invade the beaches of Normandy, because while Berlin celebrated the arrival of the Tiger II, the US Army loaded England's ports with more than 8,000 Shermans ready to land en masse. And it didn't matter how many Tigers were waiting, the account no longer closed. The M4 Sherman wasn't built to win duels, it was built to win the war. Its origin lies not in a general's table, but in the cabinet of William Knudsen, a General Motors industrialist hastily called by Roosevelt to lead the war production effort. The logic was clear. The United States had no time for perfection. They needed mass tanks, easy to operate, easy to produce, easy to replace. The Tiger was a masterpiece, the Sherman a tool. Its design followed simple industrial principles: welded chassis, standardized turret, adapted airplane engine, reliable transmission. But the real revolution was in the philosophy behind the machine. The Sherman was not a machine made to be admired. It was made to work, and work again after it broke down. General Patton, inspecting a newly formed unit, reportedly said, "This tank is good enough. The secret is not in him, it's in their quantity." Listen, the Sherman standardization allowed for something the Germans never achieved: field maintenance in any scenario. Crews learned to change engines, tracks, guns, and even turrets in a matter of hours. It was common to see Shermans being repaired under fire, with parts taken from destroyed tanks. There was no mystery. Each soldier was given a manual, and maintenance was part of standard training. The logic was brutally functional. The Sherman was designed with modularity in mind. Instead of dozens of complex variants, there was a fixed technical core: radial engine, front drive, VVSS-type suspension. This allowed different factories in different states to produce components that fit together without adjustments. If a part was manufactured in Detroit, it could be used in a tank assembled in Chicago. This interoperability allowed for an unprecedented phenomenon: decentralized production on a national scale. While Germany depended on a few factories under constant bombardment, the United States spread its production throughout the territory. Each state became a link in the chain. If one factory went down, 3 others took over the delivery. This decentralization was more than industrial, it was psychological. The tank ceased to be a symbol and became a military consumer good. More than 400,000 civilian workers, many of them women, participated directly in the manufacture of the Sherman. The Rosies, the riveters, weren't just welding steel, they were hastening the end of the war. In 1943, the Detroit Tank Arsenal delivered a new Sherman every 38 minutes. In a single day, more tanks than the entire German monthly production. This speed allowed the design to be constantly adjusted. New version of armor implemented the following week. New tower added in batch. The Germans had been testing prototypes for months. The Americans updated in series. The battlefield was the factory. By the technical standards of the time, the Sherman was average. Front armor up to 76 mm, effective range of 1,000 meters, 75 mm gun initially, then 76 meters. But its effectiveness was not in the technical sheet. It was in the constant presence. Each time a Sherman was destroyed, another took his place. The enemy did not face a tank. He was facing a tide. In the deserts of Africa, in the mud of Italy, in the fields of Normandy, in the ice of Belgium. He was there. The most heard phrase on German radio in 1944 was, "Mehr Shermans unterwegs," more Shermans on the way. German doctrine despised the Sherman. Goebbels mocked in public broadcasts. He called the M4 an American coffin on tracks, claiming that it was vulnerable to any impact. In tests, the Tiger could destroy a Sherman from almost 3 kilometers away, while the M4 needed to reach less than 1,000 meters to cause significant damage. The irony is that Americans knew this and accepted it. The Sherman's design did not envisage beating the Tiger in direct combat. I planned to ignore it, surround it, saturate the field with enough targets until the Tiger ran out of ammunition, ran out of fuel, or simply got bogged down. The logic was cruel. For every Tiger we would lose 5-10 Shermans, but in the end the Shermans would still be advancing. General Omar Bradley described American doctrine in a dry sentence: "We are not going to win because of a better tank. We will win because our tank never stops coming." This phrase has become a mantra in campaign workshops. When a German commander, after losing his position, asked how many tanks the Americans had brought, the answer was invariably more than yesterday. And there was an often overlooked detail. The Sherman was lightweight. It could be transported by ordinary ships. He could cross standard bridges. It could be towed by trucks. It could be launched by port cranes in a matter of minutes. The Tiger, with its 57 tons, needed specialized transport. Its engine consumed too much fuel. Its maintenance was delicate. It was a beast. The Sherman was a crowd. In June 1944, when the first Shermans rolled along the beaches of Normandy, German soldiers recognized them from afar. They had heard about them on the radio, in intelligence briefings, in trench rumors, but what they didn't know was how many would come. And they didn't stop coming. In the first month after D-Day, 102 Shermans were landed in France. By comparison, all of Germany had, in combat, only 102 Tigers on that front. It was no longer a war of confrontations, it was a war of permanence. And the Germans were running out of time, out of steel, and out of replacements. This logic would leave a deep mark on the accounts of veterans. A Wehrmacht officer captured in Normandy would say under interrogation, "We killed 10 of them. 20 came back. We killed 20. They came back 40. We only have one Tiger, and he broke." This phrase, more than any graphic, sums up the truth of modern warfare. The one who has the best does not win. Those who have enough win and know how to do more. But there was still a problem. Having a functional tank is one thing. Having an army capable of repairing it in the field, replacing it in days, and feeding its supply chain for thousands of miles is another. Because the next American advantage wasn't in steel, it was in maintenance time. And the Germans had not yet understood that every minute stopped would cost an entire position. In 1942, while the Germans were still debating adjustments to the suspension of the first Tigers, the city of Detroit was transformed into the largest weapons factory in modern history. Chrysler's tank armory, nicknamed the Million Machine, didn't just produce tanks, it produced pace. American engineering broke with European military paradigms. Soldiers trained with airplane engines instead of their own engines. Wheels and tracks were identical to those of commercial trucks. Electrical systems came from agricultural tractors. There was no room for technical preciousness. There was a plan, speed, standardization, and total modularity. A Sherman was ready to leave the foundry for the battlefield in 48 hours. Meanwhile, in Germany, each Tiger was still assembled by specialists piece by piece, with clipboards and manual calipers. The revolution was not only in the production conveyor belts, but in the mentality. The American government signed contracts with private companies, distributed tasks among states, and encouraged factories of sewing machines, refrigerators, and automobiles to adapt their lines. Singer produced towers, Ford welded hulls, Cadillac delivered engines. Instead of a command center, the US has created a living, decentralized, and redundant network of production. As Germany's skies darkened with Allied bombs, American factories lit up entire neighborhoods with their 3 daily shifts. More than 350,000 women entered factories between 1941 and 1945. Many had never worked outside the home. Now they welded, cast, assembled tanks under the supervision of industrial engineers. The image of Rosie the Riveter was not propaganda, it was statistics. At plants like the one in Warren, Michigan, the Sherman's full production cycle involved more than 200 workers. From crude steel plates to the roaring engine, there were 800 meters of continuous line, crossing the shed from east to west. And the most impressive thing, even with constant design adjustments, production did not stop. The tanks evolved in real time. Each new batch learned from the previous one. In Germany, changes to the design of a tank required weeks of adaptation. In the American arsenal, a re-entry into the line was enough. And this mastery over the process wasn't just a matter of ingenuity. It was a strategic weapon. The Allied command knew it could plan campaigns based on tank availability, spare parts, and logistical predictability. Each tank destroyed was replaced, every piece burned, changed on the field. This allowed for maneuvers that the Germans considered unthinkable. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Germany, a pioneer in military mechanization in World War I, chose sophistication. The United States chose repetition, and they repeated with such efficiency that they were able to supply not only their own armies, but also the British, French, and Soviet ones. The Lend-Lease program sent more than 17,000 Shermans to allies. Some fought in Africa, others in Kursk, others in Italy, all with interchangeable parts, all with the same logic. Work, even if it's ugly. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more detailed content like this. Because behind every statistic, there is a steel cog and a moral decision. While German Tigers had to be transported in special wagons, dismantled to cross bridges, and fueled with jet fuel, Shermans could be stacked on freighters, landed with cranes, and powered with standard diesel. In just 1 week, the artificial port of Mulberry in Normandy landed more tanks than Germany had produced in 6 months. It was an equation without poetry, but with power, and this power was felt at the front. German officials reported that the biggest difficulty was not destroying the first tank. It was knowing how many would come later. Major Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division would write after the war, "We destroyed the tanks we saw." But 3 others were already approaching before the heat of the first fire cooled down, and when units tried to react with their precious Panthers or Tigers, they found that something essential was missing: maintenance. Spare parts were scarce, transportation was slow, and factories were under constant attack. It was like fighting with porcelain in a field of stones. Meanwhile, the Allies set up mobile workshops with enough spare parts to reconstitute entire battalions. In some regions of Normandy, the American 3rd Armored Division kept more reserve tanks than operational German tanks at the front. Fueling was so effective that some commanders preferred to lose a damaged tank and order a new one rather than repair it. And this logic was not waste, it was optimization of effort, because for Americans, time was as valuable as steel. By the end of 1944, the United States had produced more tanks than all the Axis powers combined. But this number still does not reveal the real abyss, because what was behind each Sherman wasn't just a factory, it was an entire country spinning in sync. From Pennsylvania steel to Texas diesel, from Tennessee aluminum to Chicago labor. The American war machine was, above all, a rhythm machine. But not all this production would be of any use if the tanks did not arrive intact in the field. The next question was critical. how to ensure that thousands of Shermans crossed the ocean, landed on mined beaches, and still arrived ready for combat. The answer would come from another invisible innovation: the engineering of floating ports and the art of naval logistics. Because it is not enough to produce fast, it is necessary to deliver accurately, and the Germans still believed that this was impossible. In theory, the Tiger was unbeatable. But in practice, it required something that Germany could no longer offer: time. Time to train, time to repair, time to teach a man how to operate a machine that looked more like a locomotive than a fighting vehicle. Each Tiger crew needed weeks just to learn how to maneuver the 57-ton Colossus. The gearbox was so sensitive that engaging a wrong gear could destroy the entire system. Visibility was limited, the turret rotated slowly, and miscommunication between crew members cost lives. In most cases, soldiers received theoretical classroom training with chalkboards and manuals without ever physically getting into a Tiger. In some training centers, there was only one operational tank for dozens of recruits. The result was predictable. Men sent to the front without knowing for sure how to start the engine or tow the vehicle in the event of a breakdown. The problem was aggravated by the accelerated loss of veterans. As the Tigers fell, through combat or mechanical failures, the experienced crews disappeared with them. And unlike the United States, Germany did not have an automated replenishment system. Each new tank was delivered with an almost always inexperienced team. It was like delivering a commercial plane into the hands of a newly graduated pilot in the middle of a storm. Meanwhile, the Americans set up an integrated training system, led by Fort Knox and dozens of other centers scattered across the country. Each recruit learned to operate, disassemble, clean, and fly a Sherman from the first week. Not with manuals, but with real tanks. The average practical training in the US was 12 to 16 weeks, with track tests, night maneuvers, combat simulations, and live fire sessions with war ammunition. It was common for American operators to be instructed to perform basic maintenance blindfolded, changing tracks, lubricating, and even resolving electrical faults under simulated fire. The doctrine was clear. Each soldier had to be also a mechanic, a gunner, and a driver capable of taking any position in the tank. Versatility was taught as survival, and this preparation, apparently banal, created a decisive differential on the field. While the Tigers broke down and waited for specialized units, the Shermans were repaired by the crew themselves, with spare parts stored inside the hull. A spare screw, a spare filter, a makeshift tool. It was all part of the standard field kit. In the German documents, reports of operational failures grew every week. Many Tigers were abandoned, not because of destruction, but because of the crew's inability to react to simple problems. Overheating, radiator failure, clutch pressure error. Complex engineering turned against those who were not fully prepared. The Shermans, with their Continental radial engine or their GM 6246 diesel version, could be restarted in the field with a simple adjustment in the distributor. In some cases, unused tanks were back in operation in less than 2 hours. The difference in doctrine became abysmal. While the American soldier prepared to continue, the German soldier prayed that the tank would not break down. This discrepancy deepened even further in the combat rotation. The US Army could rotate trained units, maintain reserves, and supply the front with troops already familiar with operational models. Germany, bogged down on multiple fronts and short of time, sent semi-trained units to face American veterans with lighter but infinitely more familiar tanks. By 1944, the US Army had trained more than 16,000 full Sherman crews. The Wehrmacht in the same period was able to train only 3,000 Tiger and Panther crews combined. The result was reflected in the losses. For every Sherman lost, 2 more were sent. For every Tiger lost, months of production and training disappeared without replacement. This weakness was known within the German High Command itself. In a 1943 internal memorandum, General Oberst Guderian warned that engineering excellence has become our undoing. We are training warriors to pilot Jules. And the problem wasn't just mechanical, it was moral. The soldiers knew that their tanks could not be replaced easily. They knew that a mistake would cost not only the vehicle, but the confidence of the entire division. The fear of failure became paralyzing. In the American battalions, the opposite. Making mistakes was part of the process. You learned quickly, repaired naturally, and returned to the fight. This doctrinal difference became lethal in the first combats in France. When a column of Shermans advanced, there was no pause. If one tank was destroyed, the next one already occupied the position. The Germans, lacking maintenance cover and with hesitant crews, saw their Tigers immobilized, surrounded, captured, or detonated by air raids. The accounts are clear. Most of the Tigers destroyed in 1944 and 1945 did not topple under direct fire from another tank. It fell due to the impossibility of continuing. And while the Germans tried to explain their losses, believing they were facing some new American model, the Allied intelligence report stated the obvious. It was the same tank, but with more trained people, more spare parts, more confidence on the field. The machine that wasn't supposed to win was winning because it worked, because any kid from Iowa could operate it with a wrench. But there was an even more humiliating moment to come. Because, even with poor training, breaking tanks, and scarce fuel, the Germans still believed that their artillery and mines could hold off the Allied advance. Until the day they saw American tanks coming out of the sea, as if the ocean had become a factory. Floating tanks, amphibians, ready for combat before they even touched the ground. And this vision would break the morale of many commanders once and for all. Because if the Shermans now also came through the waves, how many more were yet to come? In the early morning hours of June 6, 1944, the war changed scale. Under the dense fog of the French coast, the Allied ships began to emerge like a metallic tide. More than 4,000 tanks were ready to land, most of them Shermans. And on the horizon, hidden in the holds of freighters, another 8,000 were waiting their turn. It was the largest amphibious movement in history, but above all, it was the landing of industry. Operation Overlord wasn't just an invasion, it was a mathematical statement. Germany positioned 102 Tigers across the Normandy front, a ridiculously small number in the face of the approaching avalanche. For the first time, an army invaded a continent with the certainty that each destroyed tank would be replaced within 48 hours. Allied engineering had designed not only tanks, but the very road on which they would march. The artificial ports of Mulberry, set up in record time, allowed the continuous landing of armor, ammunition, and supplies. Floating dock, unloading ramp, supply platform, all designed so that the war would not stop for a minute. While the Wehrmacht dug trenches, the Allies paved France's coasts with supplies. The difference between the two sides was no longer in the weapons, it was in the rhythm. With each Tiger that fell, the German front shrank. With each Sherman destroyed, the Allied front strengthened. The most symbolic scene of this operational abyss was visible in the early hours of D-Day. Shermans swimming, converted with duplex drive kits, dozens of amphibious tanks descended into the sea and floated down to the sand, firing before they even touched the ground. Many sank, but that didn't matter, because behind them hundreds of others were waiting. The math was relentless. If 30% were lost at sea, 70% would still fight on land. And if they were all lost, another 1,000 were ready in the rear. The war was entering a new phase. For the first time, one side could afford to lose, because it had what the Germans no longer had: replacement. During the first 24 hours of the landings, Allied tank losses were severe. It is estimated that more than 200 Shermans were destroyed or immobilized. But this did not delay the advance. On the contrary, The mobile workshops, installed a few kilometers from the beach, already received the first damaged tanks before sunset. Wounded crews were replaced. Damaged equipment was replaced. In some units, tanks were recovered, replenished, and returned to the front line in less than 12 hours. The battlefield was no longer a breaking point. It was part of the logistics cycle. On the German side, the reaction was slow, hesitant, and disjointed. The 21st Panzer Division, positioned near Caen, received confusing orders. The reinforcements came in drops, and the Tigers, considered precious weapons, were kept in reserve, waiting for the decisive moment that never came. Every move needed authorization. Each displacement required analysis. Each loss was considered a logistical tragedy. What the Germans called precaution, the Americans called backwardness. And time in that war was the most lethal asset. General Paul Hauser, commander of the German 7th Army in Normandy, would write in his reports, "It is like fighting a steel mill. With each position recovered, 2 new enemy columns appear, and none of them hesitates." The doctrine of American replacement was beginning to show its true strength: mobility, substitution, and continuity. The Allies didn't win by the strength of each tank. They won because their tanks were always there. The Allied strategy was not to crush. It was to occupy, deplete, saturate. On many stretches of the front, American units advanced even without full artillery support, relying only on tank volume. The Sherman, even vulnerable to German guns, became deadly due to insistence. A tank not beaten by armor but by repetition. One Tiger could destroy 5 Shermans in one combat, but after destroying 5, he was surrounded by the 6th. And if he resisted, the 7th arrived. There was no truce. There was no break, just more tanks. The feeling of helplessness took over the German battalions. Many reports mention the same expression, Übermacht, super strength, not for quality, but for overwhelming presence. The war had been reduced to its coldest essence, sustained quantity. And this quantity moved with industrial logic. The American supply chain operated like a conveyor belt. Tanks, fuel, parts, ammunition, feed, clothing. Everything followed a planned cadence. It was not improvisation. It was a project. By the end of the first week after D-Day, 200 Allied tanks had landed. Germany, on the other hand, had not been able to reposition more than 30 armored vehicles. Each loss was final. Each tank destroyed was a hole with no replacement. German doctrine, built on the ideal of invincible weapons, collapsed in the face of a relentless industry. But even in the face of this collapse, many officers still held the illusion that super tanks, like the Tiger II, would reverse the course of the war. They still didn't know that, even with reinforced armor, superior range, and overwhelming firepower, their new steel monsters were already born surrounded, because war was no longer fought only in the countryside. It had settled in the workshops, in the ports, on the railway lines. And the next part would reveal what happened when the German doctrine of technical excellence tried, once again, to answer the impossible, facing 49,000 Shermans with 489 Tiger IIs. On the battlefield, what remains in motion survives, and what stops dies. This was the rule that the Germans learned too late. The Tiger Verfers, a symbol of technical supremacy, featured an almost poetic Achilles heel: the complexity of its own excellence. Its Maybach HL230 engine, while powerful, was temperamental and thirsty for high-octane fuel, something scarce in 1944. The transmission was so delicate that a change required cranes, heavy tooling, and a specialized team. The simple act of replacing a broken unit could take up to 2 days. If the breakdown occurred in a combat zone, the tank was abandoned, known to be lost. Worse, its interlocking wheels, designed to absorb impact, accumulated mud, snow, and ice. On the Eastern Front, it was common to see Tigers immobilized by the very engineering that was supposed to protect them. Meanwhile, the Sherman, with a Continental radial engine or standardized diesel versions, was made to be disassembled. Within 6 hours, with basic tools and common spare parts, an American crew could remove and install a new engine. The VVSS-type suspension facilitated access to the wheels and tracks. The commands were simple, the instructions clear, and the tank itself came with compartments dedicated to emergency maintenance kits. Each armored division had integrated mechanics, moving parts depots, and support trucks capable of setting up real workshops in the open field. A war tractor that broke down and started moving again before the enemy noticed. Germany, on the other hand, insisted on seeing its tanks as elite weapons, which should not be touched by unspecialized hands. Maintenance was centralized, deadlines unacceptable. Reports from the Wehrmacht record dozens of Tigers abandoned for lack of simple parts such as track gears or fuel valves. And every Tiger lost wasn't just a machine loss, it was the loss of thousands of hours of human labor and months of factory coordination. The doctrine of perfection became an untenable burden. The most dramatic was in the fuel. A Tiger consumed on average 5 liters per kilometer. Its effective range was only 100 kilometers in open country. This meant that for each movement it was necessary to anticipate not only the route, but the construction of a dedicated supply network. The Americans, by contrast, distributed the same fuel among tankers, trucks, and planes, with adaptable engines and unified logistics. When a Sherman advanced, he carried with him not only ammunition and supplies, but also the certainty that if he stopped, he would work again. The operational difference became visible in the Battle of the Bulge. During the German counterattack in December 1944, several Tigers IIs fell by the wayside before combat even began. The reason? Wheel freezing, mechanical failures, and lack of fuel. An internal German report recorded, "We lost more tanks to the weather and to our own mechanics than to enemy guns." By the end of the offensive, many Shermans had been damaged, but more than 60% had been recovered and reintegrated. The abandoned Tigers would never work again, and there's one fact that the Germans completely ignored and that sealed their fate. For every German field workshop capable of repairing a Tiger, the Americans maintained 7 mobile units capable of repairing Shermans directly at the front. On average, a dead Tiger took 5 to 8 days to restore, if parts were available. A Sherman took less than 24 hours, even under fire. If this statistic surprised you, write in the comments, "Shocking data." Because the war was not decided by indestructible tanks, but by tractors that never stopped moving. General Heinz Guderian, visionary of the Blitzkriegs, would express his frustration in a bitter phrase: "We build tanks as if we were making watches, and now we find that the enemy is winning with hammers." This confession was not just technical, it was moral. Pride in technical excellence had overshadowed the obvious. Tanks are field weapons, not works of art. They need to walk. They need to resist. They need to come back. And if there was any doubt that functional simplicity was the most lethal weapon, it would be dispelled in the next phase of the war. Because while the Germans were trying to keep their Tigers running on destroyed roads, the Americans were testing a new kind of operation, crossing rivers with bridges set up in less than an hour. Mobility, not armor, became the deciding factor. And the Sherman, with its evident limits, was always ready for the next terrain, always ready for the next target, always ready to come back. In mid-October 1943, something changed within the reports of German military intelligence. For the first time, the numbers received from the Eastern Front and the fronts in Africa began to compose a picture that not even the High Command could ignore. The ratio of enemy tanks to German units was no more than 3 to 1, as had been estimated in previous years. Not even 10 to 1, as some officers already suspected. In several sectors of the front, the ratio had exceeded the symbolic mark of 100 to 1. 100 Shermans, T-34s or Churchills for every operational Panther or Tiger. The enemy was no longer just numerous. It was incessant, and the generals who had once called these figures Allied propaganda now saw them before their eyes, in the form of metal columns that advanced day and night, supported by endless artillery, planes, and logistical trucks. On paper, the Tiger was still superior. In the countryside, he was already an exotic animal, expensive, rare, difficult to feed. An armored captain of the 12th SS Panzer Division would write to his superior, "We are harvesting wheat with teaspoons. Every tank we destroy comes back in 3 days, but ours, when they fall, become monuments." The letter, intercepted months later by the Allies, would sum up what many German soldiers already felt, but dared not say out loud. They were not fighting men. They were fighting against a gear, an avalanche, without a face, without fear, without fatigue. The doctrine of fear was reversed. Until 1942, seeing a Tiger on the horizon caused panic in the Allied lines. The armor up to 120 mm, the 88 mm gun, the imposing silhouette, everything seemed impenetrable. But in 1943, the German crew themselves began to fear the sounds coming from the sky, the crackling of American radios, the vibration on the ground of a new wave of Shermans arriving at the front line. Technical superiority was a distant memory in the face of the noise of the Allied currents. Field orders began to change. Before, commanders were encouraged to hold their position, resist, confront. Now the memoranda included expressions such as retreat tactically, preserve mechanized unity, avoid direct confrontation without numerical superiority. A Tiger was worth more standing still than burned, more hidden than exposed. The most feared weapon of the war was beginning to be preserved as a museum piece, used only in occasional ambushes. German prisoners captured after the Battle of Normandy reported the same feeling. Powerlessness. Some said they did not know how many tanks they had faced, only that they didn't stop coming. Others admitted that they had fired until they ran out of ammunition, only to see that the enemy column remained intact. A lieutenant captured by the U.S. 2nd Armored Division stated, "You don't have tanks, you have factories with caterpillars." The phrase, recorded in the interrogation files, reflected not only irony, but restrained admiration. The veterans of the Eastern Front brought another dimension to psychological collapse. After exhausting battles against the Soviets, where the numbers already decided battles, these soldiers expected to find in the West a more rational, more technical, more traditional enemy. Instead, they found Allied lines stocked as assembly lines. Every day, new tanks, new soldiers, new trucks. Each night, artificial lighting kept the advance, the repairs, the refueling. It was as if the war never stopped. As if the Americans had found a way to keep the engine of war running 24 hours a day. The numbers reflected what morale was already screaming. In 1944, the United States produced, on average, 1,000 tanks per month. Germany, under intense bombardment, could barely deliver 100. And of these, a significant portion did not reach the front due to lack of fuel, sabotage, or destruction of railway infrastructure. The scales were not just tipping over, she was plummeting. If you're impressed by this 10-to-1 ratio, write in the comments, absolute power, because the war at this point was no longer a dispute over territories. It was a race against an unstoppable production line. The Allied commanders knew this. They used logistical advantage as a tactic. They pushed the enemy to exhaustion. They took risks that would previously have been considered suicidal just because they could. General Patton, aware of the flow of resupply he received from the rear, ordered advances even at considerable losses. To him, each tank destroyed was a statistic. For the Germans, it was a tragedy. But the greatest tragedy was yet to come. Because while Germany watched its hopes sink into the mud, the United States was preparing for the last phase of the war with something the Nazi war machine never had: reserves. Not just tanks, but men, parts, fuel, ammunition, planes, trucks, engineering, and morale. And it was this reserve, this uninterrupted industrial breath, that would begin to open the gates of Germany itself, because the next phase would not just be combat. It would be occupation, and for that the Shermans were already crossing the Rhine. In a war dominated by machines, heroes also become obsolete. Nazi Germany built its armored doctrine on the figure of the technical warrior, the prodigy commander, the infallible gunner, the steel pilot. Otto Carius, one of the greatest armored aces in history, destroyed more than 150 enemy tanks in his career. Michael Wittmann, the Tiger Rider, paralyzed entire columns with flanking maneuvers and surgical shots. But even they, the names that decorated the reports and served as propaganda for the morale of the troops, began to realize that something bigger surrounded them. Because the war was no longer won by tactical genius, it was won by replacement. Carius, in his memoirs, would record bitterly, "We could destroy 10 tanks in one day, but we knew that the next day they would be 20. Wittmann, in one of his last broadcasts, reported, "The Shermans don't stop. They are faster, more numerous, and they reappear where we have just cleaned." Individual talent, which had been decisive in the initial blitzkriegs, could no longer keep pace with the enemy. The Tiger was a precision weapon. Every shot had to count. Every maneuver had to be measured. The Sherman, on the other hand, was a piece of the system. It could make mistakes. It could topple over. It could burn. Because another one was already coming. And another. And another. This impersonal model of warfare began to erode not only the efficacy of German doctrine, but its very identity. The Panzerkommandanten, trained for years to operate perfectly, found themselves surrounded by platoons of tanks that operated in a system, radio-coordinated, supported by planes and a logistical rear guard that seemed unaware of the concept of scarcity. Each Tiger depended on a general, an engineer, a miracle. Each Sherman depended on a production line, and the difference was in time. On the Western Front in 1944, speed became a lethal factor. The Americans took villages, lost tanks, replaced them with track trucks. The Germans, on the other hand, had to calculate each offensive as if it were their last. With each mistake, an elite unit was lost. With each hasty advance, a Tiger fell behind. A Wehrmacht commander would write, "We are obliged to win with surgical precision. They win with volume." It was the most accurate definition of the new combat logic. The hero's symbology was also diluted. While the Germans celebrated individual commanders, the Americans valued the collective, the peloton, the division, the gear. Few knew the name of a Sherman's commander, but everyone knew there were thousands of them. And that changed everything. The enemy was not a figure. It was a system that did not rest, that he did not hesitate, that he didn't value each tank as a relic, but as a unit that could be lost without trauma. And there was also the most sensitive issue of all, the expectation of return. While the Americans trained their troops with the idea that they would be replaced, the Germans knew that every man was irreplaceable. Every Tiger destroyed was a lament. Each crew lost was a whole. American efficiency transformed the battlefield into an environment of continuity. German doctrine turned every casualty into a tragedy. In several engagements, the Allied commanders used their own tanks as bait. They advanced with the first group of Shermans to absorb fire and reveal the enemy position. Next came the bombers. Then more tanks. The loss of the former was accepted, calculated, cold. On the German side, the loss of the first Tiger meant retreat, reorganization, hopelessness. It was the end of a line, because there would be no other in his place. By the end of 1944, with the Siegfried Line about to collapse, the last German armored offensives were already operating with symbolic numbers. Operation Wacht am Rhein, known as the Battle of the Bulge, featured 313 Panthers and 136 Tigers, compared to more than 1,800 Shermans on the US side alone. Even with local tactical superiority, the Germans knew it was a matter of time before the wave reorganized itself and crushed the serpent's head. There was no breadth, there was no depth, there was only talent, and talent doesn't win when the field becomes a statistic. If in 1940 Germany invaded with confidence, in 1945 it retreated with resignation. What was once offensive was now survival. What was once conquest was now containment. And the great aces, the same ones who were once feared, came to understand that they were fighting a machine that didn't need heroes, because the enemy was the factory, the train that brought more tanks than the reports could count. And if there was still any doubt about the collapse of this doctrine of perfection, one need only look at the German planes in March 1945. Shermans advanced on enemy territory in convoys with integrated air cover, infantry, and mechanics. Meanwhile, the remaining Tigers were camouflaged, abandoned, or blown up by their own crews so as not to fall into Allied hands. And many of those that were still functioning had only one destination: to slow the advance for a few more hours. But there was something even more symbolic about to happen, because soon it would not only be American tanks that crossed the heart of Germany, it would be their trucks, their radios, your detailed maps. Its logistics were so precise that it anticipated resistance before it even arose. The war was about to be decided by another invisible factor, a supply system so efficient that it made it seem as if the Allies were always in the right place at the right time. And that accuracy would come from an unlikely place, from the largest system of maps and supply forecasts ever created. In the spring of 1945, the sound of war was accompanied by a more constant, deeper noise, the noise of American columns in motion, not just tanks, but trucks, workshops, generators, fuel barrels, parts, trailers, telephone cables stretched out on the clay. Where the United States advanced, the rear moved with them. A British lieutenant, upon witnessing the setting up of an American advance base on the outskirts of Frankfurt, wrote in his diary, "They are no longer just fighting, they are installing a war." What the Germans called excess, the Soviets began to call a miracle. And civilians, on any side, saw in the American convoys a new definition of force, not the roar of cannons, but the relentless presence of supply. In Normandy, a few months earlier, the Allied depots had already looked like cities. Makeshift warehouses housed thousands of tracks, cannon barrels, radios, ammunition, spare parts. At night, floodlights illuminated repair areas where damaged Shermans were welded, new engines, wheels replaced. Technicians slept in tents between transmission boxes. Mechanics operated shifts as if they were in Detroit. Each American battlefield became, within 48 hours, an extension of the factory that produced it. The British, accustomed to scarcity and reuse, watched in amazement. The Soviets, accustomed to brutality and quantity, recognized a new kind of superiority: predictability. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, after a technical visit to the Western Front, stated in a meeting with the General Staff, "They never stop, neither to sleep nor to refuel. Their tanks are always stocked up before battle." To an army advancing with massive human losses and tanks patched with makeshift signs, the idea of a logistical system that predicted war seemed like science fiction. In Paris, civilians saw Sherman tanks crossing the avenues already washed, repainted and refueled, less than a week after emerging from the Normandy mud. Children hung from the tanks as if they were toys in a mobile park. Journalists recorded convoys arriving at railway stations, transformed into redistribution centers. "It looked like a circus in motion," wrote correspondent Ernest Hemingway, "except that each car carried a part of hell." The astonishment was not only in the strength, but in the regularity with which it emerged. Germany, still hopeful of a turnaround with miraculous weapons like V-2 rockets or Me-262 jet fighters, quietly observed that the real miracle wasn't technical, it was logistical. Each Tiger destroyed required months of replacement. Each Sherman destroyed was replaced before the burial of his crew. Reports from the OKW, the High Command of the German Armed Forces, already recorded not only the difference in material, but the moral effect of this on its troops. The constant presence of resupplied American units is destroying the psychological resilience of our forces. Meanwhile, American maintenance battalions operated as mobile arms of industry. Tanks that broke down on the side of roads were not abandoned. They were towed, repaired, and returned to combat within 24 hours. In some cases, mobile workshops operated out of railroad cars, allowing the war to proceed without pause. A sergeant of the Third Army reported, "We changed engines in the mud, in the rain, in the dark, and no one complains, because we know that tomorrow there will be more." This awareness of continuity transformed the American soldier into part of a cog, not a heroic piece, but a functional cog in a system that would not stop. Even the closest allies were impressed. Marshal Montgomery, known for his meticulousness and skepticism, reportedly said during a visit to the Allied Logistics Center in Le Havre, "If we had this rear guard in El Alamein, we would have been in Berlin last year." It was a tacit admission that for the first time, victory was not the result of tactical genius, but of management engineering. And there was another detail that began to stand out: the replacement without bureaucracy. An American armor commander could order parts, ammunition, or new vehicles with standardized codes directly by radio. Logistic convoys knew where to deliver before they were even called. Each front had redundancy of supplies. Each unit had the autonomy to act. It was the war by catalogue. One sergeant joked, "If my radio breaks, I'll get another one before lunch. If my tank breaks, I get another one before dinner." Yet on the Soviet front, where supply was slow and centralized, this seemed like a fantasy. Germany, where every tank was a monument to engineering, watched its own mistakes take physical form. Tanks sitting still, no parts, no fuel, no future. A Wehrmacht colonel wrote in March 1945, "They don't have any better tanks. They have a world where tanks don't need to be good, they just need to be there." The civilian population also noticed this difference. For many French, Belgians, and Dutch, the arrival of American forces was not just liberation. It was the arrival of a force that seemed inexhaustible. The sight of Sherman's columns, GMC trucks, Willys jeeps, and even adapted agricultural tractors reinforced a feeling. This war could not be won against those who moved as an industry, and it was precisely this sensation, this inevitability, that would become the ultimate psychological weapon. Germany no longer needed to be defeated in every battle. It was enough for him to see the next train, the next wave of Shermans, the next map with the next routes, because they knew that even if they destroyed all the tanks in 1 week, in 10 days they would come. But what many still didn't know was that this logistical capacity, this continuous pulse of steel and gasoline, was only one part of the plan. Because behind the scenes, the Allies were about to unveil a tool that not only underpinned the war, but anticipated its every step. A system so precise, so broad, and so efficient that it would do the impossible, deliver an entire room to the right place at the right time, with everything it would need for 7 days without a mistake. And this invisible weapon had a name. In the hardened mud of Belgium, a group of 5 American soldiers walked silently to their damaged tank. The Sherman smokes discreetly due to a failure in the cooling system. One of them, the radio operator, mutters, "We'll tow and change tomorrow." There is no despair, there is no regret, there is no urgency. There is trust, an invisible certainty that the system supports them. They are not lone heroes in a deadly duel. They are operators of a larger machine, of a logistical body that breathes behind each advance. For the American combatant, war was no longer a life-and-death gamble for each armored vehicle. It was a process, a flow, a continuous work within something that worked. This psychological transformation spread through the units as a kind of tactical calm. The Allied crews, trained on the doctrine of continuity and replenishment, operated with methodical discipline. They knew that retreating was not shame. It was part of the strategy. They knew that losing a tank didn't mean failure, it meant replacement. And more importantly, they knew that by abandoning a Sherman, they were not abandoning the war. The system continued for them, with them. In brutal contrast, the German crews bore the burden of irretrievability. Every Tiger destroyed was a national loss. Each dead mechanic was a bottleneck of months. German technical doctrine demanded excellence, and this, in 1944, was a burden that weighed on each crew member like a sentence. A Tiger commander would report, after the Battle of Kursk, "Going out into combat, we knew there would be no other Tiger. We knew that if we fell, no one would come for us, and even if they survived, who would take care of the machine?" The most advanced weapon of the war had become a tracked prison. The Americans operated with redundancy. Spare parts traveled in convoys. The instructions were printed in simple manuals. Each crew member knew where to find fuses, gears, cables. If the tank broke down in the middle of combat, the driver could disassemble the injection system with an open-end wrench and restart it in minutes. The Germans, they depended on custom-made parts, specific tools, factory technicians who often never got ahead. This difference changed behavior. An American crewman did not have to save the tank at any cost. It could evacuate, preserve life, retreat, and still be operating another armored vehicle in 72 hours. This created an army with less desperate bravery, but with more combat intelligence. War was no longer a duel. It became calculus. Let's pause here to observe a revealing fact. While Germany took more than 20 months to produce 1,000 Tigers, the United States produced 1,000 Shermans in less than 60 days, a rate 10 times higher. What's more, for each tank delivered, the U.S. Army guaranteed convoys with 100% spare parts. A triple redundancy system of support, mechanics and ammunition. If you were surprised by this, comment below, "Logistics wins." Because that's what was happening, without glamour, but with absolute effectiveness. This logistics also transformed the common soldier into a technical agent. At Fort Knox, each recruit learned how to disassemble and assemble an engine. In a few months, he was able to diagnose failures and propose solutions. In the manuals, there were step-by-step instructions, diagrams, flowcharts, tables. The Sherman was conceived as a machine that any Iowa kid could fix. And that was no exaggeration. It was philosophy. On the German side, this democratization of maintenance was unthinkable. Tanks required engineers. The process was vertical, slow, almost aristocratic. Crews often did not have the autonomy to even change a critical component without superior authorization. The direct consequence was fear. Each confrontation became potentially final, not only for man, but for unity. This psychological chasm has gone so far as to redefine the meaning of bravery between armies. For the Germans, bravery meant resisting to the end, even with failures. For Americans, it meant keeping the system running, retreating if necessary, preserving men, not wasting material. It was a functional bravery, calculated, cold, and effective. Veteran testimonials show this difference with disconcerting clarity. One Sherman operator reported, "We lost 3 tanks in the week, but no one cried, because we knew that next week we would be directing another 3. A captured German lieutenant tearfully declared, "My Tiger was unique. I took care of him as if he were my brother, but when it broke I was forced to leave it. It was like leaving home." At the end of the war, this difference would reach the moral field. Because while the Americans continued in constant advance, rotating crews, changing parts, promoting rotations, the Germans were exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. They carried the trauma of a war where each failure was definitive. This internal change in the combatants sealed the difference between two worlds. One that operated with talent but no replacement, and another who operated methodically but without haste. And in the end, it was the method that advanced. Because, from a strategic point of view, the war was no longer about who shot better, but about who returned to the field the next day. But there was still one last piece of this invisible gear that was beginning to emerge clearly, something that was not armored nor armed, something that did not carry ammunition, but coordinated entire armies. A system that, with maps, schedules, inventories and codes, managed to do the impossible: supply the war with precision mathematics. It was the soul of the American logistics system, and soon she would have a name, face, and impact. In the summer of 1944, while the Wehrmacht was slowly retreating, the Americans were advancing by leaps and bounds, and by leaps, not by boldness, but by statistics. General George S. Patton, commander of the Third Army, did something that, for any traditional army, would be considered insane. He opened 2 simultaneous axes of advance, with tanks in wide formation, little cover, and supply halfway. The reason? Because it could. Because it had plenty of tanks. Because even if he lost 100, he would receive another 200 in a week. It was the new mathematics of war. Risk was no longer an obstacle. It has become an operational calculation. The Sherman, by its very abundance, ceased to be just a combat vehicle. It became a strategic tool. On the German side, the reality was the opposite and tragic. The majestic Tiger was too precious to be lost. With only 347 units produced in the entire war, each of them became an irreplaceable chess piece. And no one sacrifices their queen in a game of endurance. This mentality paralyzed decisions. Instead of risking flanking movements, the generals retreated. Instead of exploring loopholes, they hesitated. Instead of attacking, they protected their weapons as collectors protect relics. While Patton ordered advances even without up-to-date maps, relying on the rear to adapt supplies en route, German generals required detailed reports, safe routes, and air cover before moving a half-dozen Tigers. And even so, they hesitated, because they knew there would be no replacement. They knew that each Tiger lost was a hole in the front, an absence that would never be filled. In practice, this transformed the war into 2 distinct rhythms. One side operated as a swarm, shaping the terrain with its constant presence. The other, like a blind watchmaker trying to move delicate gears in a minefield. The U.S. Army gained elasticity. It could make mistakes, retreat, change its plan, and keep advancing. The German army, on the other hand, operated with rigidity. Each plan had to succeed on the first try, because there would be no second. This difference created a domino effect on all fronts. With continuous supply, the Americans were able to maintain the siege of cities, sustain offensives at multiple points, and even relocate entire divisions without pause. In October 1944, for example, the 4th Armored Corps moved 300 kilometers with complete coverage of fuel, ammunition, and parts, without interruption. It was like moving an entire city on the march, and this mobility, this logistical luxury, made any enemy prediction obsolete. In the battle for the pocket of Falaise, the contrast reached its apex. The Germans, trapped with tanks out of fuel, cannons without replacement, and destroyed supply lines, tried to resist with elite maneuvers. But the Americans were advancing on all sides with entire regiments of armor, many of them newcomers. What the Germans saw was a field filling up again, as if they had restarted the game and were always in the same position. This abundance allowed for daring that was previously unthinkable. Patton, in one of his most emblematic orders, ordered his tanks not to stop even at night, using adapted headlights, radio coordination, and relay drivers. It was a suicidal tactic in any other war. But in this one it worked, because every tank that broke, every flat tire, every loss due to human error, was already planned and compensated. Meanwhile, the German Tigers were camouflaged, stationed, waiting for orders that would never come. Many were sunk in rivers so as not to be captured. Others, abandoned with excuse notes stuck in the hatches. The most feared weapon of war came to symbolize a failure. The failure of the doctrine that preferred quality without repetition. Abundance also altered the concept of offensiveness. Americans no longer had to wait for the ideal moment. They did not need the decisive point. The American offensive was constant, revolving around the certainty that the supply would never cease. A division could lose half of its tanks and continue advancing. The enemy had no time to reorganize. Speed became oppression, and this oppression, it came from the back of a factory in Detroit. When the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the Germans still expected the crossing to be slow, fragile, limited. That was what any army would have done, but not that one. Within 2 days, the Americans had built mobile bridges, crossed dozens of divisions, and established logistics centers on the eastern side of the river. The war was turning arithmetic, and on that account, the Germans were insolvent. A German major, in a letter secretly sent to his wife before he surrendered, wrote, "They overtake us with tanks, suffocate us with fuel, and bury us with canned food. War is now a treadmill, and we're stuck in it." It was the bitter realization of an inescapable truth. What defined victory was no longer the longest cannon, but the fullest stockpile. But there was still an invisible cog moving all this, something that made it possible to predict, supply, and replace, even before the battlefield realized the need. A system that controlled, with mathematical accuracy, the fate of each tank, each soldier, each bullet. It was more than logistics. It was a forecast. It was military calculation elevated to its purest form, and at the center of it all, there was a name: Red Ball Express. In the dim light of a ruined Germany, long after the shooting had stopped, another kind of story began to emerge, quieter, more bitter. It was no longer the roar of engines or the impact of grenades that shaped the memories of the survivors, but the dry sound of realization. The war had not been lost on the battlefield, but in the accounts, in the spreadsheets. In the deposits, General Friedrich von Mellenthin, a veteran strategist on the Eastern Front, would write with disconcerting clarity, "We have not been defeated by better tanks. We were defeated by trucks that never stopped coming." The phrase, which seems banal, was actually a doctrinal surrender. A recognition that Germany, even with its aces, its legendary weapons and its obsession with perfection, never stood a real chance against an enemy that understood war as flux, not duel. Otto Carius, one of Tiger's most respected commanders, decorated, feared, precise, went further. In his memoirs, he would say with technical resignation, "We could destroy 5, 10, even 15 tanks in one battle. But the next day they were back, and we were still trying to tow ours out of the mud." The phrase does not carry anger. He carries a respectful astonishment. Carius, like so many others, realized too late that the logic of war had changed. It was no longer a question of who had the best equipment, but of those who could repeat the equipment indefinitely, as if war were a treadmill and combat only a stage in the process. The post-war period became a fertile ground for analyses, letters, confessions. Wehrmacht logistics officers, in interviews throughout the 1950s, used a brutal metaphor. "We fight with sculptures against boxes." The sculptures, in fact, were the Tigers, each a masterpiece. And the boxes? Shermans stacked by the thousands, transported as if they were food, repaired as if they were bicycles, operated as if they were farm tractors. One of the engineers at Henschel, the manufacturer of the Tiger, would confess that, as early as 1943, he had warned the High Command, "We are creating weapons that the front will not be able to maintain." But the warning was ignored. Hitler wanted the best, and the best cost time, parts, and blood. German recognition came not only in the form of regret, but of quiet admiration. Internal documents of the armored forces recovered after the war demonstrate that the generals knew about the Allied industrial reality. In 1943, a classified Abwehr report predicted that the United States would produce more than 45,000 tanks by the end of the war. The number was ridiculed by many. They called it the exaggeration of ill-informed spies. But in the end, the data was right, and the Germans knew it before most admitted it. They just preferred to believe in the exception, in the ace, in luck, in genius. They preferred art to repetition. And war, silent and cold, does not forgive aesthetics. At Nuremberg, after the trials, a German officer summed up the bankruptcy of his military generation in a phrase that reads like something out of an engineering manual. "We try to win the age of production with the mentality of the craftsman." The phrase does not speak of guilt nor of morality. He talks about method, of paradigm. And maybe that's why it's so powerful, because it shows that Germany's defeat was not only military, it was epistemological. They were playing chess while the Americans were playing factory. This admission did not embarrass the survivors. On the contrary, many began to study after the war the logistical systems of the Allies. Von Mellenthin has written technical articles about the Red Ball Express. Carrier studied the maintenance models of light-armored vehicles. Officials of the former German General Staff even suggested in the 1960s that future European military doctrines should start with the supply chain, not the prototypes of combat. It was the definitive end of an era where the engineer was more important than the logistics operator. The Soviets also recognized this fact. In post-war assessment reports, officers on the Eastern Front analyzed that the American army is slow but unstoppable, not by its weapons, but by its rails. The external perception consolidated what the Germans themselves had admitted. The absolute power of modern warfare lies in repetition, not invention. This moment of moral clarity, in which the enemy recognizes not only defeat, but the logic of defeat, is rare. And that's why it's so powerful. There is no resentment in Carrier's words. There is no bitterness in Mellenthin. There is an almost scientific acceptance. They didn't lose because they were worse soldiers. They lost because they were stuck with a model that was already outdated, even while it was still shining in the furnaces of the castle factories. But this late lucidity, as dignified as it is, did not change the outcome. The avalanche had already passed, the tracks had already been crossed, and the Shermans, whom they despised so much, would continue to run for decades in peripheral wars, training camps and museums. The tank that was supposed to be only functional would become a symbol of victory, not by strength, but by constancy. But there was still one last cog in this system, silent and almost invisible, that made all this possible. Something that was not made of steel, but of paper. A method that allowed us to know with precision where each part, each tank, each screw would be, even before they were needed. He was the brains behind the production, the logic behind the chaos. And this logic had a name: statistics. Contrary to popular belief, mass production is not a cold concept. It's not just about speed, volume, or efficiency. For Americans in World War II, producing on a large scale meant, above all, saving lives. This logic was born not on the battlefields, but in the warehouses of Detroit, where workers like Rosie the Riveter tightened screws, knowing that each piece fitted together with precision represented a soldier with a better chance of returning home. It was engineering as a form of protection. The quick replacement of a tank meant that a crew could evacuate without guilt. An American commander could order a damaged Sherman to abandon with the certainty that another would be available, and that his men would not be punished for preserving themselves. On the German side, the reality was different and cruel. Each Tiger crew knew that their tank was irreplaceable. There was no reservation. There was no replacement. The doctrine imposed, even if silently, that the tank was more valuable than the man. Veteran accounts show soldiers refusing to evacuate immobilized vehicles, attempting repairs under enemy fire, dragging chains under mud, freezing their fingers to keep the engine warm. They died not in combat, but in desperate attempts to save machines that Germany could not lose because it could not remake. This difference in philosophy hit the battlefield with moral force. The Americans fought with the tranquility of those who knew that the rear supported them. There was no romanticism in it. There was planning. The doctrine of substitution turned each soldier into a valuable link in a larger system, one that made sense. Human life became central not only in strategy, but in operational culture itself. A lost tank was a statistic, a lost soldier, a failure of the system. On the front, this view generated different behaviors. American tankers rarely fought to the end of the armor. They retreated, maneuvered, changed vehicles. Because they knew they could. The Germans, caught up in tragic heroism, fought until the cannon overheated, until the turret jammed, until the last drop of oil. On many occasions, captured Shermans were found with empty benches. Their crews had escaped. The Tigers, on the other hand, were discovered with dead men still in the seats, futile attempts to restart burned engines. In the factories, the same contrast was revealed. American industry revolved 24 hours a day, operated largely by women, immigrants, and black workers. The logic was clear. Anyone could contribute, and everyone would be protected by the system they helped to build. This productive inclusion generated motivation. It wasn't just a soldier's war, it was a family war. The woman who welded a Sherman's turret knew that this tank would protect someone, and maybe it was her brother. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of German eyes. They knew they couldn't keep up production. They knew that each loss was irreparable, but they insisted on perfection. They thought that the fear of the Tiger would compensate for its scarcity. They did not understand that the courage of the Shermans did not come from the armor, but from the certainty that they would be replaced, that they could make mistakes, retreat, fall, and still win, because someone covered them. Because there was more. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support, like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. Your support is what keeps this research on the invisible gears of history alive. And there was one gear in particular that carried all this forward, something that connected the factories to the front, the tools to the cannon, the civilian hands to the battlefield. A transport system so precise, so efficient, that it seemed impossible for those who faced it. The name of this system became a legend among Germans and astonishment among the Allies. It was the line that never stopped, the Red Ball Express. From 1944 onwards, it became evident that the battlefield was no longer the decisive space of the war. It was merely the visible stage of a much larger, deeper, and silent gear. Victory no longer depended on tactical genius, the courage of a regiment, or the pinpoint superiority of a gun. It depended on the coherence of a system. And that's exactly what the United States built. Not just tanks, but an architecture of industrial warfare that began in logistical spreadsheets and ended in armored columns crossing bridges under fire. The Tiger, in all its grandeur, was an isolated piece. The Sherman, in all his supposed mediocrity, was a replicable part of a living organism. The difference between the two wasn't just steel, it was philosophical. This lesson was clearly understood by all who survived the war. West Germany, in rebuilding its forces in the 1950s, abandoned the idea of the invincible tank and adopted doctrines based on interoperability, rapid maintenance, and standardized production. The Soviet Union, mindful of what it saw on the Eastern Front, also reorganized its forces to prioritize scale, simplicity, and aggressive logistics. The entire NATO, in fact, has aligned itself with an American logic. Winning is not about winning battles. It is about never stopping fighting effectively. At Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, military doctrines began to include mass production as part of operational planning. The concept of total mobilization has gone from being an economic idea to becoming a military strategy. Every tank, every artillery piece, every pair of boots needed 3 replacements. Each combat unit needed 5 supply lines. War ceased to be combat and became support. It was the era of strategic depth, and industry was the soil where it was born. The Tiger versus Sherman case was not just a comparison between 2 tanks, it was a collision between 2 worlds, a world where perfection was the goal and another where repetition was victory, a world where the soldier protected the machine and another where the machine existed to protect the soldier. And more than that, it was a brutal demonstration that in modern warfare, isolated technical supremacy does not survive without a base that constantly feeds it. Not by chance, to this day, the most respected tanks in the world are not the most technically advanced, but those that can be produced, maintained and operated on a large scale. The American Abrams, the Russian T-90, the German Leopard 2, all represent a balance between power and practicality, between capacity and supply chain. Because today's generals know what yesterday's engineers learned the hard way. Excellence without scale is just expensive sculpture. This logic goes beyond the military field. It is a silent warning to any nation that intends to remain relevant in 21st century conflicts. Because war, as a total phenomenon, is a test of continuity, of resilience, of repetition. It is not enough to have the best soldier, the best weapon, the best plan. It is necessary to ensure that they can exist thousands of times, on dozens of fronts, for years on end. And this is only possible with an industrial base that breathes with the pace of the front. Nazi Germany failed not only by ideology, by strategy, or by morals. It failed because it bet on technical miracles to compensate for a logistical collapse. The Tiger was the attempt to beat arithmetic with aesthetics. The Sherman was the silent answer that said, "You can destroy one, we'll have 50 waiting." This imbalance is the portrait of how a modern war is won or lost. And if you think that lesson was buried in 1945, just look at the current conflicts. The powers that are preparing today are no longer looking for the perfect weapon. They are looking for the perfect chain. They store chips, standardize parts, train soldiers to operate multiple systems. The lesson has been learned. The real power is not in the most advanced weapon, but in the machine that can be reproduced endlessly. And perhaps the greatest irony of all is this. The country that was underestimated for producing steel cans has become the world's benchmark for sustainable power, because in the end, the war that started with cannons and steel terminations was won by something no one saw coming: a production spreadsheet, a truck of parts, and an assembly line that never slept. And this machine had a name, a rhythm, and a destination, and it still remained to reveal its most powerful symbol, the true heart of American repetition, where it all began and where no battle was lost, before it was even fought. In the spring of 1945, Germany's roads spoke for themselves. No need for speeches, no need for manuals. It was enough to look at the shoulders, the valleys, the frozen fields of Bavaria, or the destroyed bridges of the Ruhr. Throughout the Reich, the remnants of technical arrogance were scattered. Panthers with cast engines, Tigers with locked turrets, calcined transmitters, destroyed tracks, and dry reservoirs. Many had been abandoned intact, not because of surrender, but because of lack of fuel, misfire, and impossibility of replacement. They were military sculptures, frozen in time, relics of a doctrine that believed that excellence alone could sustain an empire. At the same time, columns of American tanks, many with crumpled bodywork, combat marks, engines changed 3 times, continued to cross towns and intersections, sometimes in forced march, sometimes towed, but always moving forward. What seemed like an ordinary fleet was, in fact, the ultimate expression of logistical triumph. The Sherman did not need to be eternal, it just needed to arrive. And he always arrived. In some parts of the front, the irony became unbearable. German units, desperate, began operating captured Sherman tanks. Not out of lack of loyalty, but out of pragmatism. It was easier to keep an enemy tank running than to reactivate an abandoned Panther. German officers reported that getting Tiger parts in March 1945 was more difficult than getting bread. But in Allied depots, spare M4 engines, standardized toolboxes, technical manuals in several languages were piled up. The war had become a road, and only those who could keep walking would survive. At the destroyed crossings of Saxony, at the bombed approaches to Dresden, the image was always the same. German tanks standing still, rusting with their dead crews next to them, and American columns passing by, fueling themselves on the move, replacing parts in the bucket, recovering armored vehicles in the field. It was the pure visualization of the thesis that Hitler never understood: perfect machines die without parts. Common machines expire when they have a place to fill up. It wasn't just a physical collapse, it was a doctrinal collapse. The Wehrmacht, which had invested millions of marks in museum-designed armored vehicles, was now trying to win with improvisation. The Third Reich, which had bet on the myth of the invincible, watched its war machine turn into technical scrap while the enemy recycled parts in the field. And even when the tanks could no longer fight, the surviving parts were repurposed, rebuilt, reattached to new chassis. The Sherman was a concept, not a one-off piece. The Tiger was a unique piece, and therefore a guaranteed failure. This difference was noticed even by the private soldiers. In letters found after the surrender, German soldiers described feeling helpless as they saw Allied tanks return to combat hours after being hit. One of them writes, "We shot the same Sherman 3 times this week. He always comes back. We don't have a second Tiger anymore." What was left on the roads of Germany was a moving metaphor. On the one hand, static pride, heavy, bright, impotent. On the other, functional persistence, damaged, patched, but unstoppable. And that difference shaped not only the end of the war, but the memory that came after. Because history does not keep the immovable monuments of defeat. It goes on with those who keep walking. And if the German roads revealed the end of a doctrine, there was another place, forgotten, ignored, almost invisible, where it had all begun. A geographical point that, to this day, carries the name of unbeatable repetition. It was there that tanks were born as cars, and cars became weapons, a place that produced more than the enemy could destroy. His name? Detroit. The German mistake was not only technical, it was doctrinaire, psychological, almost philosophical. Instead of realizing that the world had entered a new era of war, where quantity, maintenance, and rhythm replaced individual tactical genius, Germany staked everything on an old view, that the best would defeat the greatest, but the best, when it is rare, fragile, and irreplaceable, becomes useless. The obsession with technical excellence created a chain of decisions that at first glance seemed logical, but which revealed an abyss between intention and capacity. The Tiger, with its 88mm gun and impenetrable frontal armor, was the perfect image of this abyss. A marvel that required 26,000 parts, months of assembly, and a maintenance structure that Germany never had. Every inch of German gear has been shaped to create warlike masterpieces, but masterpieces don't win when faced with relentless multiplication. The irony is between the lines of the technical manuals. The Panther, successor to the Tiger, was born as an attempt to correct the excesses, But it brought new problems: absurd fuel consumption, constant mechanical failures, and a reduced operating time. Ferdinand Porsche's super-heavy armored elephant was virtually useless without an escort. The Maus, the largest tank ever designed, could barely cross a bridge. In each of these projects, the mistake was repeated: the search for a final, absolute, unique solution, as if the war could be won with a single stroke of genius. But the war, at that point in history, had already become a competition of resilience, of fuel delivered on time, of protected railroads, of mobile workshops. The Nazi command structure made everything worse. The decisions were not based on logistical criteria, but on political vanity. Hitler, obsessed with symbols of power, approved tank designs by their names, their sizes, their promises of invincibility. When engineers warned that there was not enough rubber for the wheels, or that the trains could not hold the weight of a new model, the answer was ideological, not technical. The result was an army increasingly decorated with weapons that were impossible to maintain. Meanwhile, the enemy simplified, standardized tanks, shared parts between trucks, planes, and armored vehicles. The Americans, as one German general pointed out, seemed to struggle with mathematics, and worse, to beat it. This mismatch was also clear in the production. In 1943, Germany produced 2,124 tanks, adding up all models. In the same year, the United States produced 29,497 of the M4 Sherman model alone. It was a ratio of 10-1. And more than that, German production fluctuated. It was vulnerable to bombings, the lack of materials, the enslaved and poorly trained workforce. Detroit, on the other hand, operated like a living machine, with unions, continuous shifts, engineers testing new models while workers were already manufacturing old ones. Every Tiger that came off the German line carried a death sentence with it, because once lost, it would never be replaced in time. The generals knew. The field letters, the diaries of the commanders, reveal a growing anguish. A Wehrmacht officer wrote, "Our tanks are better, but every day we have fewer of them, and our best men die trying to protect them." This is the central point of the doctrinal bankruptcy. The focus on the perfect machine dragged the combatants with it. The logic of preserving the tank sacrificed life. American logic did the opposite. It sacrificed the machine to save man. This ethical inversion, invisible in the spreadsheets, was decisive in the trenches. The post-war period did not erase this mistake, it only confirmed it. West Germany, under NATO, has completely abandoned the cult of craftsmanship. Its new tanks would be part of systems, not one-off works. The Leopard 1, launched in the 60s, prioritized mobility and quick maintenance. It was a break with the past. The United States, on the other hand, maintained and perfected the doctrine of mass production. Subsequent conflicts from Korea to Vietnam showed that winning a war does not require the best weapon, but the right weapon, in the right quantity, in the right place. It's tempting to look at the Tiger and see awesomeness. It is, to this day, admired in museums, revered by enthusiasts, cited as a mechanical jewel. But what it represents, in fact, is the mistake of an era that confused power with appearance and invincibility with complexity. The real power was in the factories, in the cargo ships, in the trucks that crossed continents carrying parts, in the training manuals distributed en masse. It was on the tracks and in the warehouses. It was, in short, where Germany refused to look. And if there is a definitive symbol of this era, perhaps it is the fact that, by the end of the war, many Tigers were captured almost intact, abandoned for lack of fuel, tools, or trained operators. They were not destroyed by direct combat, but by absence, for lack of everything that German doctrine despised. But the question still echoes: how did a nation with brilliant engineers, advanced factories, and experienced soldiers get it so wrong? Perhaps because he believed that genius alone could win a collective war, and he ignored that On the modern battlefield, the genius that does not repeat itself is doomed to irrelevance. And it is this thought that leads the viewer to the final revelation. The most powerful lesson of World War II is not in the tanks, but in what made them exist, and in the place that turned ordinary steel into a tool of victory. This place still pulsates, it still exists, and it keeps to this day the echoes of the largest assembly line in history. The war ended as it had begun, with decisions. But unlike in the beginning, it was not tactical decisions, nor brilliant ambushes, nor colossal tanks that sealed Germany's fate. It was the choice to ignore the pace, the supply, the time. While the United States distributed engines as if they were bread, the Wehrmacht tried to protect tanks as if they were holy relics. With each passing day, mathematics tightened the siege. And when the dust settled, the battlefield was not filled with glory, but with conclusions. Abandoned German tanks, perfect but immobilized. American columns still in motion, refueled, repaired, replaced. The collapse was not just military, it was ideological, because Germany believed that it would win with excellence and forgot that war is won with constancy. The lesson, in the end, is not just for generals. It crosses borders and eras. Modern wars are not decided by isolated heroes nor by supreme machines, but by resilient systems capable of withstanding losses, adapting, continuing. It is logistics that determines the strategy. It is standardization that wins over genius when it is fragile. And it is the maintenance of strength, physical and moral, that writes the end of the campaigns. From the battlefield to contemporary management, the truth remains. The enemy can be brighter, stronger, or more feared. But if he can't repeat his own success, he's doomed. In the words of General Heinz Guderian after the war, we were defeated by trucks, not for better tanks, not by braver soldiers, but by a system that delivered parts on time, trained men, and replaceable vehicles, while the Reich was still trying to get tanks out of bombed-out workshops. If you believe that stories like this should be told in depth, with research and respect for historical truth, support this channel with your like and your subscription. This allows us to continue bringing to light the facts that have shaped the world. Comment below, what was the most shocking data you discovered in this video, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact that history has tried to hide. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.